This is more like it. It's Commando on episode 33 of NES Works. The third and final of Capcom's 1986 releases for NES serves as a pleasant palate cleanser to wash away the taste of the past two games. This port of Commando holds up remarkably well 30 years later, despite its fundamental simplicity of design, and it offers a much clearer glimpse into what sort of work we can expect from the best NES third parties, as well as why Capcom would go on to become one of those best NES third parties. The secret behind Commando's quality? No more outsourcing, or so it seems. Commando doesn't include a staff roll at the end, being a game old enough to predate such conventions and a functionally endless game, but according to the cutting room floor, Commando's ROM does include hidden credits in the code. Among those credited pseudonymously for the NES version are designer Tokuro Fujiwara, composer Tamayo Kawamoto, sound programmer Yoshihiro Sakaguchi, and finally, programmer Matsumitsu Kobayashi. Kobayashi appears to have been the one to have slipped these credits into the code, as the ROM also contains a hidden message promoting Higemaru, the next game Kobayashi would work on. So by all appearances, Commando seems to have been the first console game developed entirely in-house at Capcom. From this point forward, that would generally be the company's MO for NES software. And while it was certainly entirely possible for outsourced NES games to turn out well, Capcom's exactingly high standards meant that Commando would be the beginning of an extended run of best-of-class NES releases. Sure, not everything Capcom produced was amazing because no one's perfect. But here, less than a year after making its debut as a Famicom publisher in Japan, the company stakes out its claim as a developer-publisher combo for NES. This wouldn't simply result in well-crafted Capcom ports and original works for NES, though. It would also set their arcade-to-NES conversions apart from their adaptations for other platforms. And we can see the roots of that approach taking hold here. Commando, as with the company's other 1986 NES releases, began life as a coin-op. It, too, hailed from the mind of designer Tokuro Fujiwara, predating Ghosts 'n Goblins by a few months. It also predated the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie Commando by several months in all regions, which means Capcom was either very canny or very lucky when they gave this game its title. This is not technically a movie tie-in, but it honestly feels closer to being an adaptation of that film than many proper licensed games of the generation. The original arcade version of Commando continued Capcom's fixation on the vertical shooter genre. More than half the games the company developed in its first couple of years of existence involved moving up the screen, destroying things. Commando, however, would be one of those key moments of genre innovation that helps a developer make their mark on the world. Just as GALAXIAN expanded on Space Invaders and XEVIOUS built on GALAXIAN, Commando feels like the next critical iteration on XEVIOUS' design. Heck, the West German release of this game, which had to change the bad guys into robots due to that country's strict ban on depictions of killing humans, even called back to the genre's roots. In West Germany, Commando became Space Invasion. Space Invaders has an even more direct line of connection to Commando. That game's manufacturer, Taito, created a shooter called Frontline in 1982 that feels like the most immediate inspiration for Commando. There's no such thing as a true first in video games, but Commando deserves canonization for its impact on the shooter genre thanks to its quality and refinement over games like Frontline. The critical design feature Commando brought to the table over its predecessors, while this was a vertically scrolling shoot-'em-up, it didn't use forced scrolling. Instead, the player had complete control over the forward motion of the action. This, in turn, changed the overall dynamic of the shooting action. Commando became less about memorizing waves of enemies and patterns and formations, and more about quick reactions. Enemies generally appear from certain locations, but they spawn in huge numbers, and they don't really move according to fixed patterns. Not only that, but the player's on-screen avatar moves differently than in early vertical shooters. Fixed scrolling shooters train your fire straight ahead, and when you move around the lower portion of the screen, you're essentially just banking, strafing, and decelerating. That's how XEVIOUS worked in 1942, and every other Capcom vertical shooter prior to Commando. But Super Joe, the hero of Commando, wasn't a spacecraft or fighter plane, and he moved around in a more natural fashion for a human being. Super Joe could move in 8 directions, and he would turn and fire in whichever direction he was guided by the player. Suddenly, vertical combat became less about gunning down hazards as they appeared ahead, and more about managing 360 degrees of space. The one traditional directional attack in Commando came in the form of Super Joe's secondary power, a limited supply of grenades. While you could fire your weapon in 8 directions, grenades always flew upward a set distance, which perhaps counterintuitively made them tactically invaluable, as they allowed players to have a fixed attack independent of their movements while dodging enemy fire. Though clearly cast from the same genre as something like 1942, Commando's added freedom of movement put a new spin on the vertical shooter and felt like a true evolution of the format. And the NES conversion did a fantastic job of adapting the arcade original. Of course, Commando on NES didn't look anywhere near as good as the coin-op game. The NES was new hardware, yes, but by the time the system showed up in reliable numbers at American retail, it was more than 3 years old. Meanwhile, Capcom was working with fairly beefy custom hardware in arcades, and the chipset that powered Commando outstripped the NES in every respect. The 4-person team responsible for porting the game could reproduce the action quite effectively, but they couldn't hope to recapture the original look and sound of the game. And here's where we see the advantage of having the original coin-op designer take an active role in the console conversion. Fujiwara, one assumes, took pride in his creation and wanted its home port to be the best possible work he could create. The NES couldn't reproduce the detailed shading and the fast speed seen in Commando's arcade version, but the home console offered other advantages. Last episode, I referenced the way Super Mario Bros. And Ghosts and Goblins debuted within days of one another and represented the fundamental design dichotomy between console games and arcade works. Mario, having been designed for home play exclusively, offered a more fundamentally fair experience, packed with secrets, while Ghosts and Goblins had a harsher edge to it and existed to drain players' pockets of quarters as quickly as possible. Commando on NES splits the difference. This is fundamentally an arcade-oriented work, yes, but Fujiwara and crew softened the NES version and added new, hidden depths to the game not present in arcades, and also not present in any other home port, all of which were handled by external developers. The most immediate improvement you'll notice in Commando on NES versus Capcom's other launch titles is that it runs a lot more smoothly. As with 1942, the action involves flooding the screen with enemies and bullets at every possible moment. But that intensity came at a cost in 1942. The programming logic simply couldn't handle moving everything around simultaneously. Both the player's jet and the enemy ships in 1942 moved on alternating frames, scooting along, then pausing to let other objects take their turn. While subtle, this trade-off made for a choppy-looking game that felt naggingly sluggish. Commando, on the other hand, manages to run almost without compromise. It's not perfect, as there's a fair amount of sprite flicker, and enemy soldiers do have a tendency to randomly vanish from the action. But by and large, Commando offers the most intense action yet seen on NES, and handles it with grace. The home version of the game also feels somewhat more forgiving than the arcade original. Super Joe's hitbox seems to be a lot smaller on NES than in the coin-op version, which means there's a lot more grace when a bad guy or bullet grazes him. The trade-off is that enemies seem to have tighter collision detection as well, so your aim has to be true. But given a choice between a forgiving design that requires greater precision and a loose but punishing design, I'll take the former any day. Anyway, were Commando simply a more technically capable home conversion than its immediate predecessors, that alone would be enough for us to breathe a sigh of relief and look forward to Capcom's future. But the game's creators took an extra step in the process of adapting Commando for home play, one that hints at true NES greatness to come. Commando at heart is a pretty simple game. You advance upwards, firing at endless swarms of enemies, attempting to reach and destroy the enemy fortress at the top of the scrolling field. There are some neat embellishments that make the game more than simply a vertical shooter, of course. Besides the player-controlled forward scrolling and Super Joe's 8-directional fire, Commando also incorporates physical barriers and other elements on the battlefield. There's a limited element of cover and depth here. Players and enemies alike can hunker for protection behind sandbags and other emplacements. Opposing forces can duck into trenches and foxholes from which to fire at you. Enemy vehicles sometimes appear, ranging from staff cars to motorcycles, and sometimes they'll zip across the field via bridges. All of these battlefield complications block your machine gun fire and force you to either rely on your grenades, or else to learn to dodge and juke with great efficiency. Features like pools of water, enemy watchtowers, and rickety bridges help make the background graphics into something more than the scrolling wallpaper you flew over in 1942. Here, backgrounds shape the flow of battle and force you to improvise when you reach choke points full of bad guys. This was true in the arcade game, and it's true here at home. But what the arcade version lacked, what's present on NES, were secrets and bonuses. The original version of Commando was little more than a chase for the high score. The NES version retains that element of the game, and as with the original, it's basically a 4-stage loop that grows progressively more difficult with each iteration. But your grenades have an extra purpose here. Not only can they help clear out otherwise inaccessible foes and give you a constant, reliable forward attack while you evade enemy fire, grenades also have the ability to reveal hidden secrets. Each stage in Commando contains hidden passages beneath the battlefield, which can only be revealed by hitting their opening with a grenade. Inside the passages, you'll find a variety of interesting things, from hostages to rescue to temporary upgrades like machine gun enhancements. These extras add variety to the gameplay, but more importantly, they give players much needed incentive to replay Commando. A 4-stage loop of intense score-driven combat is all well and good in arcades, but when you've paid your money up front and no longer have quarters at risk on a home console, a 4-stage loop of combat where intriguing secrets lurk beneath your feet and can potentially give you even greater combat prowess, that's the difference you need to make an addictive game. From this point on, the approach Fujiwara took with Commando would define Capcom's arcade to NES ports. While other consoles would present players with direct arcade conversions of various degrees of fidelity, the ports Capcom produced for NES added embellishments, bonus, and even total overhauls. Games like Section Z and BIONIC Commando would be less conversions and more like sequels. And this design philosophy would soon be taken up by other developers, with games like Tecmo's RYGAR and Technos' Double Dragon adopting meatier mechanics to compensate for the fact that they simply couldn't look as nice as conversions to TurboGrafx-16 or Genesis or even Master System. Of course, Nintendo's alleged licensing requirements that NES conversions be unique from ports to other systems also had something to do with this. But with Commando, Capcom paved the way for the NES's future. And you can't even say that Commando was a bastardization of the source material. The arcade game designer's name appears in the NES's hidden credits. It would be the height of backseat driver arrogance to suggest he was somehow compromising his vision by updating the mechanics of his game to better suit a new platform. So the NES has stumbled a bit as the platform is expanded to include third parties in addition to Nintendo's own work. But now, we can look at the clunkiness of games like M.U.S.C.L.E in 1942 as mere growing pains. Of course, as with any platform, the NES's library would be checkered and uneven. But Commando sets a new standard, sitting up there alongside some of Nintendo's own best, as a game with simple but effective mechanics, interesting design ideas, rock-solid action, and enough added substance on NES to give it some decent shelf life. With Commando, the future of the NES has arrived. Next time on NES Works, like I said, it's going to be a bit checkered and uneven.